It appears dropping best patch since EOD was so embarrassing for ArenaNet that they decided to announce Evolution coming to Guild Wars 2 to hide all the positive feedback they weren't prepared for. Jokes aside, what we saw is strongly suggesting that underwater weapons will no longer be strictly underwater, or at least Spear specifically was shown in the teaser. Time and circumstances of this teaser's release are reminiscent of last year's expanded weapon proficiency teasers, aka first mention of spec weapons getting detached from elite specs. This makes me think underwater weapons going over water might be expansion launch feature like weapon proficiency was, while later down the line we get another batch of existing weapons assigned to classes that didn't use them before, like we've seen with Warrior's Staff, Necro Swords, etc, etc. That however is not important for the moment, as we have sort of concrete info at hand. That's water weapons coming to land. I say water weapons, not specifically Spear, because many classes have already existing weapon skills for Spear Gun and Trident, and adjusting already existing skills to function in different environment is much more resource efficient than creating something from scratch. Further than this, some underwater weapons, Elementalist's Trident for example, are distinct and unique enough from the rest of the class's arsenal to be ported one-to-one with minimal adjustments and still find its own unique niche. But let's not get too hasty. I can only reasonably speculate about very few classes from the top of my mind, and let's start from the one I'm the most familiar with. Warrior's Spear is a peculiar case, as it practically shares a skill with already existing warrior ground weapon. Mariner's Frenzy is for all intents and purposes better 100 blades. It does 8 tick of damage and a final strike that hits for more than the previous ones. It is 1-to-1 100 blades in its active function, but allows you to move while channeling and delivers all its payload in less than half of 100 blades duration. If it doesn't suffer a stroke mid-evolving from fish to mammal and doesn't make you forget how to walk, even with half of 100 blades damage, Mariner's Frenzy will remain the superior version of it. Which not only makes some sense, it also justifiably makes me angry. Instead of going berserk though, let's continue onward. Barbed Pull is the most potentially explosive button in Spear's current underwater arsenal. Sure, you may bring up the fact that Staff already has Pull and Tyria didn't collapse all of a sudden, but you must understand that Staff is a support weapon, so it has very little damage, on top of which its Pull has half of Barbed Pull's range. Warrior having 1200 range Pull is a very interesting idea. Consider pairing Spear with a hammer and dropping Barbed Pull into Fierce Blow from 1200 range, or Barbed Pull into Backbreaker. Or quite the opposite, following after your hammer combo with Mariner's Frenzy to capitalize on its relatively quick damage delivery. Or using it to harass opponents standing in pulsing blindness fields that used to be safe from Hammer Warrior's Wrath. Already, Spear seems to be interesting choice to pair with the hammer, and we haven't yet considered that it gets block as well. Parry is practically riposte but with more damage on the counter. If you have experience playing as or facing warrior, you already know what does that mean. Shieldmaster goes brrrr. Fifth weapon skill here is Tsunami Slash, which is probably the one requiring biggest adjustment in translation. While remaining skills require rebalancing at best, Tsunami Slash would just not work on land, period. It is a long-range dash in a straight line, similar to Rush in its traversal, but dealing multiple instances of damage along its path, just like Whirlwind attack does. For the sake of doing damage, this attack won't go past targeted foe with its traversal, which unfortunately makes you a bit of a sitting duck for its duration. Whirling Axe allows you to move freely, Whirlwind attack evades for its duration, and Rush ends as soon as you reach your destination, all alleviating this issue. Tsunami Slash is an amalgamation of these three, keeping you locked into a trajectory with no evasion and continuing to spin in the face of your opponent, which is a recipe for eating every CC your opponent has in store. This skill will change the most, that's for certain. Either it will have some sort of defensive effect to compensate for its downsides, or have more freedom of movement. But wrapping up existing Spear skills, we have Wild Whirl, which is an AoE stun. In Berserker's case, AoE Pull. Both of these would be somewhat strong setup tools, as much for solo roamer / side noder as for hybrid support with heretic stats in PvP. Oddly, Land Spear has potential to be more beneficial for Warriors build diversity than all of Soto was. With a block, a pull and AoE stun, Spear synergizes well with defense and might function as a replacement to both Dagger Shield as well as Hammer or Greatsword in most commonly played Spellbreaker builds. especially if its best receives the Skullcrack Earthshaker privilege of CCing and doing damage simultaneously. Moreover, Forceful Greatsword affects Spear as well, so there's higher than zero possibility that the strength improvements we saw earlier in the patch preview are to enable Greatsword plus Spear warrior builds. Spear would be a fine addition to Warrior's weapon roster. It doesn't outdash mobility-focused weapons, it doesn't enable bunker more than it needs to, and it doesn't invalidate any weapon specifically. It is just a solid all-rounder with that bit of spiciness in form of 1200 range pull. So long devs don't completely shive Tsunami in translation like they did to Berserker's Dagger F1, we are in for a treat. 1200 range pull in a warrior 1v1 with all the reflects is going to be peak comedy. Opposite of that, Harpoon Gun is not worth talking about. Not in Warrior's case at least. Warrior's Harpoon Gun skills are Pew, Vulnerability Pew, Fan of Pew, Brutal Shot at Home, Quadruple Pew and Big Pew. Warrior's Harpoon Gun is a copycat of its rifle, just shittier. Most interesting skills in this roster are direct one-to-one copy of old Brutal Shot and Quadruple Pew, as its every hit knocks back, which unfortunately means that it wouldn't do damage in normal PvP. Warrior doesn't need another rifle, considering the current one isn't even remotely viable for PvP or PvE. Sure, Gunzerker exists, but all of you must understand that Gunzerker is a troll build demanding much bigger effort, several mistakes on enemy's side, and plain luck to succeed in PvP or World v World environment, while in PvE, rifle just doesn't have enough damage to find use. I'll gladly take Warrior not getting anything over getting Land Harpoon Gun. Arena better waste resources fixing rifle that we already have than making another even worse. Now let's take a look at some other classes as examples of why I think spears aren't the only thing coming. Contrary to Warrior's Harpoon Gun, Engineers is pretty interesting. Scatter Mines, a fan of explosive projectiles, isn't maybe the most unique concept under the sun, but it certainly is more interesting than Gun Go Brrr or Backshot Bonanza we usually see in games. Capture Line is very similar to Warrior's Barbed Pull, so you can copy-paste me gushing over it here. And moving forward, Timed Charge is the skill I wanted to talk about the most. Timed Charge is a projectile that does no damage, but applies an effect that does damage after a hefty delay. Not doing damage initially means applying this effect doesn't break invisibility, making for potentially interesting player interactions. Further than that, setting up one-shot combos with delayed explosion is much more interesting and interactive than flinging fragging frag grenades for the rest of eternity. Final skill Net Wall, however, isn't that much of a thrilling concept. As you see, just because Warrior's Harpoon Gun is trash doesn't mean all of them are, and at least Engineer's Harpoon Gun would be worth at least consideration in terms of putting it into land combat. As for my other example, Elementalist's Trident. You may immediately recoil and ask, wait, wouldn't that be too similar to Staff? And that's the neat part, it wouldn't. Sure, fire skills aren't anything special with just load of AoE damage, but other attunements make up for it. Water gives you massive exploding ice orb, a wall of ice that shatter on enemy pass-through, dealing high strike damage, AoE CC around you that also heals you, and rush-style dash that heals allies and damages enemies you pass through. Air grants you disrupting stab but ranged, an explosive projectile that you teleport to upon its explosion, which you can port with mid-casting overloads and shit, ranged CC and a static field with a roof. And finally, Earth gives you a shotgun, a projectile that destroys projectiles, more ranged CC, and a shard attack. What I'm saying is, we have an assortment of interesting weapons that are dead in the water only because they are, well, dead in the water. Early mains wanted for a long time their artillery mage weapon, and with how much ranged damage, CC and other interesting utility Trident has, it could fill that niche perfectly. It would be unwise and resource inefficient for ArenaNet to release only Land Spear, when not every class has access to Spear to begin with, or to port skills from other underwater weapons to the Land Spear, blocking themselves from possibility of adding Spear to these classes at later date with an assortment of completely new skills. And if ArenaNet ports one underwater weapon of every class onto ground combat, and then announces that all classes get one more new weapon down the line midway 5th expansion, it might outsell Soto in half of the time. Anyhow, regardless if I'm right or wrong, we can start honing our appetites, as everything seems to suggest drastic improvement from the bar that Soto set up. And with that said, Crabface out.